Um, all right, we'll make a start then. So, diagrams. My first question is, what do students find hard about diagrams? Like, what do students find difficult about diagrams? Does anyone have any thoughts?
But just that they mix up micro and macro a lot.
So, do you find that they mix up within those as well? Like, do you find that they mix up the diagrams within macro and within micro, or just that they're just all over the shop?
Just all over the place. And so we teach, so I teach macro and the other teacher does micro. I feel like they should be able to separate it a bit more, but still, especially in like timed assessment conditions, they just seem to forget.
I find that they only seem to remember the last diagram that they've learned. And after like the last thing that they've learned just kind of wipes out everything that came before it. Any other things that we find difficult that we find that students struggle with?
I think probably using the diagrams effectively. So sometimes the knowledge is there and they get the diagram. And, you know, if I'm on the macro side at the moment as well. So they do an ADAS diagram, change something and it might be labeled correctly. And then they just don't use the diagram to its full potential. So they don't fully analyze what's going on in the diagram. They just sort of say, well, you know, Y1 moves to Y2 and then think that's their job done, full stop, and they then move on. And they don't really use the entire diagram.
They don't use it as a tool. They see it as like an add-on, as an extra thing they have to do, rather than seeing it as a tool, like a visual representation of what's going on, so that they can actually see stuff and not kind of not using it. Ryan, have you got anything?
Yeah, I was about just on that really. For me, they just kind of just add it on if they're talking about a certain topic. They just kind of just write the diagram for the sake of writing the diagram. They don't actually talk about the diagram and use it to help analyze their answers or develop their answers.
I heard a really good. Oh, go on.
No, I was just going to say, sometimes I think that they just memorize the diagram.
Yeah.
They've revised and then they've memorized it, so then they know. So I teach IB and A levels, so especially in the IB essays, they know they have to do a diagram. So they've seen what the topic is in the question and they've memorized it, so they just draw it, but then they don't know how to fully analyze it.
I had a really good tip from someone once, and they said that every time you draw a diagram, you should do something to it, because the diagram shows the static situation. You need to do something to it. You need to move something or show a change on something. You need to actually do something with the diagram rather than just drawing it, because I think that kind of comes back to the thing about whether we use it to illustrate a point or as a tool of analysis, kind of to see what's going on.
I think that the diagram on its own is knowledge only, isn't it? It is the lowest level skill, pretty much.
Yeah.
So you're right, Isabel. Unless you move something and then subsequently analyze it, you can't possibly end up with the higher order skills. And on its own, it is very much just almost that lowest order skill that we're looking at.
Sometimes I think they know what to move, but then they still can't explain.
They still don't talk about it.
Yeah.
I think that perhaps comes down to as well is that they sometimes separate it from their other intuition, so students don't make links between. They see it's kind of seen as an additional thing, but they don't see it as a visual representation of the theory that they know or that the intuition that they know. They kind of don't link those things together, particularly with cost and revenue type diagrams. I think they don't. It's almost like they learn the numerical version and they learn the intuitive theory version and they learn the diagram version, but they don't see those as almost like a tripod of all showing the same thing. I think another thing that I found that I've just written down is shifts versus movements along, particularly right at the start of the course. And I think lots of students, I think this might lead to lots of other problems, but lots of students don't understand why a curve or a line is that shape, and therefore don't really understand why it would move. And I think if they don't have that very basic understanding of why each curve is that shape and the reason behind it, then that makes everything really, really difficult. Before we move on to solutions to those problems, which I'm hoping you're all going to just give me solutions, thank you. Any other kind of issues that come up quite a lot?
Well, I have just talking about because I teach business as well. So they have to do simple demand and supply and like price elasticity of demand in business. And they really don't get it, because you literally just have like a lesson where you do what you will have done weeks in economics, and they don't understand. And so the difference between a movement and a shift, I mean, and what the difference, they don't even understand the difference between demand and supply. So if the question asks about supply factors in the business exam, I mean, they just write about demand.
They just kind of have kind of the
Understand
knowledge
it.
of it. I think at least with diagrams in economics, we use them often enough so that we should be able to build up the skills, but it's whether those skills are transferable between each diagram. I don't know. Do you find that students in general who are better at a certain type of diagram are in general better at another, or do you find that they might be able to be perfect at one and be really able to manipulate one graph but then can't manipulate another?
I think it's probably the latter, and therefore it comes down to their understanding of what it's the point of the diagram and what it's showing and how it can be used, which just needs to be drilled into them in some cases. It's quite a repetitive skill, isn't it? But
I'm coming on to that one in a minute.
Yeah,
so my next question was going to be, any of those does anyone have any solutions to any of those problems? Obviously, I'm guessing that no one's going to be like, this is the silver bullet that you can use to fix all your diagram problems. But if anyone said something and you thought, oh, actually, I know something for that. Anything?
One thing, just to sorry, go on, Ryan.
I'm saying for me, because I teach business and economics as well. So I just got like mini whiteboards and I just kind of hammer it into them. I just do practice non-stop. So it kind of gets a little bit repetitive, and I tell them they're going to hate me after the end of the lesson. It kind of helps like sink in a little bit with them, I find.
When you do practice, we'll skip kind of towards the practice bit, I think, because that's an interesting question. So my background is I trained as a maths teacher. My degree's in economics, but I trained as a maths teacher. And there's a lot of maths, there's blogs all out there, hundreds of blogs about how we practice, like repetitive practice, and how that's useful, and all the kind of bits and pieces behind it. So Ryan, you clearly drill a lot of practice. When they've got whiteboards, do you show them do you ask them to do different situations? Are you asking them to manipulate the diagram, or are you asking them to recall the diagram, or a bit of both, or what kind of questions are you asking them?
When at the start of it, like this kind of goes into the starters a little bit. So if in the starters, normally I'd get them trying to retrieve a certain diagram or a certain scenario. When I'm practicing, I'll try and change the scenarios. So I have loads of different scenarios, which will require a certain slight change in the diagram. And then once I've felt that I've mastered that, I'll move on to something else, but then kind of slip the odd previous example back in to try and see if they understand it again.
Back in. So just lots of almost drill practice with lots and lots with changing different variables at different times. Any other sort of practice techniques?
I'd say exactly the same as Ryan. I think whiteboards at the start of every lesson, it's almost a default starter, to be honest. I know you can be crazy and inventive with starters, but ultimately the mini whiteboards, doing the diagrams, changing the shifts, mixing it up, as Ryan said, I think it's a default go-to, really. So yeah, starters and sort of almost plenaries as well. It's a bit of a default one, especially at the moment where I don't know if anyone, sort of the current situation at the moment, but sort of we've given it kids their own whiteboard, so they're not sharing it. So they've got their own hole punched into their files, so that we're constantly using it. Get your whiteboards out, and it's just non-stop, really. And
how did you manage that during remote learning?
I used whiteboard.fi. But it's I found that it was a bit clunky to start with, but I think it's got a bit better. But exactly the same scenario, whiteboard.fi, and it was really quite good actually. You just, whether you're using a tablet or a computer, you can just draw it on, and all 10 or however many you got in your set, they all just appear on your screen. So it's quite a lot of impressive at that.
So it comes up with it's almost like a bubble with each person's whiteboard on, so you can see everyone drawing once, but they can only see their own and yours. So they can see your whiteboard and their own whiteboard. I think that's fun. I'm guessing that helps you to kind of do the kind of assessment side of it as well. So you almost don't need to record how well they're doing, because you get a kind of gist of it. In maths, there's a lot of talk at the minute about, there was a lot of talk, I say at the minute, I mean like 2 years ago, about, they do a lot of minimally different questions and changing just one thing at a time, and or intelligent practice is kind of another sort of very similar thing, where they change one small thing at a time and you see what difference one small thing makes. So kind of just changing one variable at a time and showing how that changes. And I found that quite useful to bring across into economics, because they I think it helps them see that the knock-on effect, but what doesn't change as well is quite an interesting one, so they don't kind of almost throw the baby out with the bathwater. Any other things that are useful for diagrams?
Have you come across the Secret Diagram Club blog?
No, sounds exciting.
It's honestly, it's a great lesson. Can I share screen here?
Absolutely. I might just need to let you. Hang on.
I'll dig mine out. Hang on.
There we go. Yeah.
So basically, let's see if I can do this. If it doesn't work, then shout. Right. So I've got that list, which is just a macro list of about 24 diagrams. Can you see that? So basically, just so and this could be micro, could be macro, could be all sorts, but it's just a list. And I think I used this as a revision one towards the end of last year, because it seems to be pretty much everything on there. So I think I had 12 in my set, and so there's 24 diagrams, so they had 2 each. So I cut them out and gave them 2 each, and then let me find it. Hang on a sec. Well, let's be. Hang on a sec. Take that off. Sorry, just give me 2 seconds, because I have got this somewhere.
No. I'm waiting with bated breath. If you stick secret in front of anything, it makes it automatically.
So it's not mine. So here it is. So it's just a PDF, and it was on a Tutor2U blog originally. So I'm sure if we Google it, it'll come up. Right. So it's that. And so it's quite simple. So basically, you produce 24 or however many you've got, little boxes like that. And so the aim is, so they've got 2 diagrams each, and then you get them to write out 1 to 24 on a bit of paper. They can fill their first 2 in, and then they draw the 2 diagrams that they've been given, and then you collect back the little slips of paper, and they've just put the number, for example, on there, and then they pass the diagrams that they've drawn around the class, and the game is to identify the 24 titles. And usually it works quite well, and obviously they've got to draw it perfectly. Sometimes if they're not confident, I let them use their notes so that it is a good quality diagram, so you can obviously tell. So they get their first 2 perfect, and then they've just got to identify the rest of the diagrams from the rest. And it goes around, and you can sort of, play a game. The first rule of Secret Diagram Club, you don't talk to your friends about Secret Diagram Club, and you sort of ham it up a little bit. But then at the end, what they should have, and you can obviously go through it at the end and make sure they've got the right answers, but they end up with a list, with your original list of 24. So then the follow-up work to that can be, right, go away and draw all of them, or next lesson you're drawing the first 10 or whatever. So it's so it's just a PDF, but if you Google Secret Diagram Club, I think it was a Tutor2U blog by someone, and I've just used it every year since then. I think it works really well.
I like that. So, and I guess it works for micro, macro, whatever.
And yeah, that was a macro example I had, but yeah, micro, macro, or you could do it, lower year 12, year 13, or you could just do it for a particular topic, or. So that's I've always found that one to work quite well. And like I said, if you just have a search on Tutor2U, play around, you'll find it pretty quickly.
Exciting. I really like the look of that. When we're practicing, if you're practicing diagrams in isolation, i.e. not with it in any particular context, do you think that works, practicing in isolation? Because in some way, part of me thinks that then it's worth working on each tiny little thing and perfecting each little thing. So like do 20 questions of finding revenue and 20 questions of, I don't know, finding equilibrium or something. I don't know. But then part of me thinks that if it's not related to a kind of context, then, how easily can they then convert that into, I guess, an exam scenario or a kind of real life scenario? Or does anyone do any practice specifically at turning something into context, like going from a generic diagram to one that's in context? Am I making any sense? Because I find that it's like what we said, they can't use the diagrams because they can't pick out like the information on the text that tells us what shape things are, or, that tells us, well, that line's going to be a bit flatter because it's clearly elastic, or, this axis is going to say that, and it's mentioned 20%, so we need to have 20% here, or I find that that's the skill that I find that they have the least, is that they see because they see the diagram as separate from everything else, that I find they struggle to bring it in context. I mean,
teaching A level and IB, I find IB are better at it because their internal assessments, basically what they have, I don't know if you know, they have to take a news article and they have to do an economic commentary of the news article. So they have to analyze and they have to create the diagram for the specific article. So they want to find good articles as well, that they can even put figures onto their into their commentaries and stuff.
So they're building that as they go along.
They do. Well, they have to submit 3 commentaries to their IB from 3 different areas of the syllabus, but they can do up to 5 commentaries and then send off the best 3 from 3 different areas. So I feel they get quite a lot of practice at that, and they're, especially by the last one, like at the moment they're doing the trade one with me, which is the last one, and I just know that it'll be fine because
so how do they get to the point where they're good at it?
I guess just through doing them.
So just by giving them an article and saying, what would the diagram look like?
Well, they have to find their own articles.
Oh, really?
Them articles, yeah.
So I mean that's something that I really haven't done much of, is here's an article, what would the diagram look like? But that sounds like a really good shout. I like some of the Curious Economist articles are probably quite, leading on to the starters type thing, because they're quite short, but they generally have a bit of, they normally have some numbers in them.
Well, I was thinking when Ryan was saying before about doing lots of practice, especially at the start when they're doing demand and supply, sometimes I would give them like a news headline or a little extract from something in an article, and then get them to draw what they think the diagram would look like. That's
yes, I sent with the sorry.
No. I was gonna
with the Economist. I find the Economist has so many great articles that you can use for especially demand and supply and stuff like that. It works so well, especially like economies of scale and stuff like that. So this week when I've been doing my remote learning, I was kind of focused on case studies. So I've just given them a case study a day, and they've had to come and create a diagram for that.
That sounds really good. Do you use the big articles, or like the at the start of The Economist, there's politics this week and business this week, isn't there? And those are quite good for picking out lots and lots and lots and lots of repetitive, stuff. You can almost do that quick fire, but they haven't got the detail of the rest of it. Or do you use a bit of both?
You normally a bit of both, but normally I'm trying to use the bigger articles, and I kind of trim down some of the content that's not that relevant, because I do want them to try and have to hunt for the information a little bit as well. I don't want to just give them the information too easy.
That's
so it's the big kind of.
I think I don't let them struggle enough. I think I give it to them in too smaller. I mean, it is a trade-off, isn't it? Because if you cut it down, then they can get more, they can do more, and they can have more practice, and they can become a bit more fluent in it. But I don't let them struggle enough, I think, and then they're probably not very good at finding it. And actually, a lot of times in the exams, it's not particularly, you do have to hunt for it in the exams. That's a really good point. I had
like red herrings in there as well that you might need, but you need that. That's obviously once I think that they're kind of ready for it. And I've got them now to kind of write a blog about a business they find interesting. And for one, I've just finished market structures. They have to say whether they believe Amazon and stuff like that, talking about the market structure they're in and trying to find and create a diagram that fits in with Amazon. So I like that as well.
I've got a question about that later. I'm going to come back to you about that. How do you teach diagrams? We've talked a lot about how we practice diagrams. Thanks, Ben, for that link. We've talked a lot about how we practice diagrams, but teaching diagrams for the first time, I had a bit of a revelation. The first time I taught, the first time I taught economics at all, I used purchase, I used some PowerPoint slides I purchased, and they just had they put the diagram on the screen and then explain it. What I found makes a big difference is building the diagram up in front of students. So starting with blank axes, and we want to show the relationship between this and this. So that's what we're going to put on our axes. And, now I want to show the relationship, you know, this goes down while this goes up, so it's going to be this shape, and then I want to move this, then I want to see what happens when we do this, so then that curve's going to shift, and kind of building it up and almost telling a story of the diagram rather than giving them the diagram and explaining it. I think starting with a blank page, because in their brain it probably is a blank page at that point, they don't know any of it, and building it up, I think I found really helps with their intuition and kind of linking it to their intuition. Any other tips for teaching diagrams for the first time?
Yeah, I would completely agree. We've just sort of been doing international trade and the tariff stuff, and you can also do a lot of recapping. So whilst you're sort of, you know, you're putting your demand and supply, because you're going back to a bit of micro, aren't you, with the tariff diagram. So you're putting your demand and supply, and in my analysis later on, when there's a, you know, a tariff is either added on or taken away, part of the analysis might be talking about the change to consumer surplus or producer surplus. So there's lots of ways in which you put the demand curve in first, and then ask them, you know, what the demand curve actually shows, what the supply curve shows, then the tariff goes in, then we're revising consumer and producer surplus. So definitely building it up. I think that's an absolute, a key thing. And it helps them, doesn't it? Because they can't, just produce a diagram from the start. They've got to understand. It goes back to that first point we made earlier about understanding the topic. And we always say, you know, diagrams, we've got to produce ACE diagrams, which is your sort of axes, curves, equilibriums, because even now, you know, if they're upper six, they're still producing a diagram and they've forgotten to label aggregate demand, or they're not labeling the equilibriums, they're just showing the shift, and then, you know, they're just potentially not accessing the marks that they could do.
When you recap over diagrams, do you, something that I'm not particularly good at is, when I first teach diagram, I'm really big on why is this curve this shape, and really making sure that, but I probably don't go back enough and ask them 6 months later, and why was this curve this shape? Because I think after a while they sort of, because it just ingrained that the marginal cost curve is that shape, or that, I don't know, the aggregate supply curve is, well, debated, but I think they start to see it as like in very, very superficially, and they kind of stop thinking about what it represents. When you go back for things like tariff diagrams and you're doing your revision, do you find that you then ask those questions, you know, why is actually the demand curve this shape, or why is this bit going to be flat, or that kind of thing?
I saw a video of, I saw a video of like a primary school teacher asking the kids to like write instructions on how to like butter toast and stuff like that, and I just thought I'll do that with my my year 13s. So I asked them to draw a diagram, and I said I forgot, can you tell me how to draw a diagram? And they said, can you draw the average cost curve? And I was like, yeah, what is it? I pretend you're teaching your gran or something, and they said, it slopes. So I did it completely wrong. I said, what do you mean it slopes? And I said, why does it slope like that? So I was kind of playing absolutely dumb with them to try and see what diagram they would draw. And it was a bit of a laugh, but I said, like, you need to be accurate. You need to tell me why this happens. So, because I said I'll help them when they're analysing, it'll make more sense to them then in the exam when they go on to analyse it. It makes a bit more sense to them understanding why it curves like that and why, you know, MC curve goes.
It's like the inner workings of a machine, isn't it? It's like, it's like a bicycle. You know, if you know how it works, then you can fix it and you can change it. Whereas, you know, you might be able to fix a bicycle because that's a bit simpler and you understand it, whereas I couldn't fix a toaster. It's kind of like the more you understand the inner workings of it, the more you can kind of manipulate it and pull it apart and change it. And that's what they need to do with it, isn't it? But if they're just giving a very kind of if they have a very superficial understanding of it, it seems like you're really asking, but why? Why is it this shape? What, you know, exactly what do you mean? I really like that.
But as well, by the time you get to trade, sometimes I ask them, well, what do you think the tariff's going to look like? And some of them just draw absolute nonsense. But like, yeah, just have a bit of fun. Like, well, what do you think it might look like? Why might that look like that? And then, yes, some of them guess it right. Like,
I mean, they have enough information.
By the time you've got to trade,
put it together, don't they? By that point, I'm guessing. Ben, did you have something?
Yeah, no, I like Ryan's idea there. I was getting them to do the deliberate mistakes as well. So if you're working with whiteboards, you know, producing a range of diagrams, but you must include a deliberate mistake, and then, you know, getting them to swap over and see if they can identify the mistakes. And again, it's just reinforcing that learning of what's right and what's wrong.
I like I'm getting lots of ideas from this one. I'm definitely gonna have to go back and make notes and listen to the recording. Oh, yeah, just one thing about when we're talking about shifts versus movements, I did find one thing really useful, is when we were first doing demand and supply diagrams, well, when you first talk about even the factors that affect demand, before you've even kind of really drawn a diagram, I get them to do lots of different diagrams. Instead of just price and quantity, I might have temperature and quantity, if you like looking at ice creams or something, and I don't know, price of substitutes and quantity. And so drawing each graph, like looking at each relationship in its own graph, and then just showing that price is just one of those graphs. Because sometimes I think that they think that like the PQ diagram is this be all and end all type thing, and don't necessarily always understand why. And understanding then that because P and Q is then included in the diagram, we don't need to draw a new line if price changes, but kind of looking at other diagrams as well. So maybe changing the axes, and what does the demand curve look like if you're looking at demand versus, I don't know, advertising revenue spent in that market, and just seeing it as one graph against lots of different graphs, so they kind of see that that's already included. Because I think that's what they don't always understand, is that, you know, prices and it's like an endogenous variable, isn't it? It's already included in there, and that's why it's a slide and not a shift. But I have found that's sometimes quite useful before kind of leading more into the demand curve. So I don't know if that's perhaps worth a look. How many other questions did I have? So we've kind of talked about why students struggle, and Ben, you've touched on this, but errors that students make. So it's not necessarily they don't understand, but what errors do they make? What kind of, you know, the silly mistakes type things that do lose the marks? So you mentioned not labouring the equilibrium. Any other kind of common mistakes? I find they always forget what the possible axes of a PPF diagram is.
It's about when you were saying that they think that the P and Q is the everything. When you get a PPC that has P and Q, I'm like, what's this?
And then suddenly everything is general price level and GDP as well. Like it's like the one or the other. It's because they seem to forget that everything else existed before that. What was I going to say? I also find that students. Oh, Yusuf said. Oh, sorry. I also find that students. Hi, Yusuf. Come straight from another seminar, hopping from one to another. Is that students find it really difficult to like identify areas and understand why an area links, you know, and I think sometimes actually that links to the fact that they can't actually remember how to they don't remember that the length times width is a rectangle, so they don't understand that timesing two dimensions together is going to give you kind of you know, a subset of those dimensions anyway. Any kind of tips on finding points, finding areas? Just lots of practice, I'm guessing.
Just making the diagrams really big and clear as well. We sort of, one of my kids did an essay, and I use this one as an example, but the diagram was sort of a little postage stamp in the corner with writing around it, and it was just horrendous. And just, you know, making it so big and clear. I mean, we just talked about tariffs, but if we're going to identify the area of tariff revenue, if that's too small, it's so easy to go into the triangles at the side rather than just sticking with a rectangle. So again, just really making diagrams.
How big do you say they should do it? Do you give them
Say again?
How big do you give them a guideline of how big you want their diagram?
third of a page minimum, I say, if not half a page, because they've always got space in the exam. They've got plenty of paper. They're not. I know they feel that paper is this commodity. They've got to get as much writing on.
When they're paying for it, it is.
You know, in the exam, they've got this exam booklet they'll never get to the end of it, so they've just got space to do it. So don't give the examiner an opportunity to go, that's not clear enough, I can't give you the marks.
I think IB say it has to be a third to half a page.
Oh, really?
Okay, yeah.
So because I taught IB first before A-level, I'm just used to saying that.
I worry that I get them into bad habits, because when you're explaining something at the board, and then because we think like an economist, because we use it as a tool, you're showing something on a diagram like as a kind of half measure. Do you know what I mean? When you're talking about something, you go, oh yeah, but because of course this happens, and then because that's often just a kind of tangent, I worry that then I end up drawing teensy little diagrams that aren't very well labeled, and then I wonder why they do it. But any final thoughts on diagrams before we move on to market structures, which is another mammoth topic? Any last words? No. Okay, we'll move on then.